as an independent art curator and researcher focusing on the art of Houston in the early 20th century. He has written on the subject and has curated or co-curated a number of exhibitions, including Rice Institute and the Visual Arts in Houston, 1900 to 1960, Houston Art and Houston Collections, works from 1900 to 1965 at the Heritage Society, Emma Richardson Cherry, Houston's first modern artist, at the Edison Gallery, Houston Public Library in 2012, and Left Bank on the Bayou, Avant-Garde Art and Theater in the 1930s Houston at the O'Kane Gallery at the University of Houston downtown. As an inveterate researcher, which some might say is a nicer term for nosy Parker, he loves reading other people's letters, especially when they're the fascinating letters of that amazing Houston artist, teacher, and civic leader, Emma Richardson Cherry. He also delights in collecting the art of Mrs. Cherry, along with that of her contemporaries in the Houston of 100 years ago. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Randy Tibbits.
Thank you very much, Tam. It's a delight to be here. Well, welcome to the coveted first thing after lunchtime slot. I guess it's up to me to say some particularly spicy things to keep everybody awake if I can. But luckily, my topic would seem to give itself to that sort of thing. This instruction is to me and to you because I've been known to gallop along in my presentations at a whisper. So if I start doing that, somebody please let me know if there's anything else you need to let me know while I'm talking. Those of you who know me may be surprised. Can you hear me, by the way? I've got mics all over and I'm not sure what's working. Yes. You can hear me? Those of you who know me may have been shocked when you saw that I was giving a presentation that didn't focus on Emma Richardson Cherry. Actually, it was a bit shocking to me too. For those of you who don't know Mrs. Cherry, I hope there's no one here, but just in case, when she came to Houston in 1896, she was arguably our first professional artist. And throughout her time here, until her death in 1954, she was, without any doubt, one of our most important modernist artists. After careful consideration and perhaps a somewhat creative new look at the Cherry Archive, however, I realized that in fact I could include Mrs. Cherry in my talk. When she was still Emma Richardson in her younger days, she dedicated herself to being an artist. And she studied in Chicago, and she studied for many years at the Art Student League in Chicago. Finally, at the rather advanced age of 28, advanced for her day, she, and apparently after a great deal of persuasion, she agreed in 1887 to marry Dillon Brooke Cherry in Kansas City. They married in late October, and in early December, Mrs. Cherry, then Mrs. Cherry, set out for a 2-year trip to Europe so that she could study, learn more about that then most modern art, Impressionism. Well, even though she was a newlywed, she set out on this 2-year trip without Mr. Cherry. She was, however, in the company of the woman who's in this portrait on the right, Mary Hoyt Seller, who was a friend of hers from her days in Illinois. Pardon me. This was the first of a number of trips that Mrs. Cherry took throughout her life to around the United States and to Europe, trips that often were months at a time, or as in this case, years at a time. And on those trips, she never traveled with Mr. Cherry, but she almost always traveled in the company of other women. One of the most important of those trips she took in 1925-26 when she went to Paris to learn what was then the most modern, Cubism. She studied with the Cubist painter and teacher André Lotte. While there, she painted these 2 female nude studies in a Cubist mode, as well as a few others, which, by the way, as far as I've been able to tell, are the first Cubist paintings that were done by a Texas artist. And when they came back, when she brought them back to Texas with her in 1926, it's very likely they were the first Cubist paintings by any artist to actually wind up in Texas. Pardon me. Let me remind you that this was the Paris of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, of Natalie Barney and Romaine Brooks, of Janet Flanner. On that trip, Mrs. Cherry was traveling in the company of a much younger woman named Clemence Tanqueray Robinson. I'm not certain how they met, but they seem to have met a few years before in New York, and however it was they met They became very close, and they remained close throughout Mrs. Cherry's life. Clemens was writing her letters until 1954 when she died. Unfortunately, Mrs. Cherry's letters to Clemens don't seem to have survived. They were so close, in fact, that they even had pet names for each other. Mrs. Cherry was Cerise or Charitza, and even signed works of hers in the period with one or the other of those. And Clemens was Clemitan. Cherry painted at least these two portraits of Clemitan, whom she referred to as Botticelli-esque. Writing back to her daughter from Paris in the spring of 1926, Cherry said, "Clemitan leaves today for Russia, and I am glad I'm soon to go home too, for it would be doleful here at first without her. No one fills her place." This is Mrs. Cherry in her later days, and as I say, as I was considering this topic and after a great deal of thought on the matter, I decided that, in fact, it's very, very likely, I can say, I think almost without reservation, that Mrs. Cherry was indeed a modernist. Now, that may not be exactly what you expected me to say right here. And I will admit that I set you up. But I did it with a purpose. I have no reason, in fact, to think that Mrs. Cherry might have been a lesbian. I do feel fairly certain that she enjoyed the company of talented and often adoring younger men who were themselves homosexuals. But her own sexuality, I have no real information on. It is interesting that she, as a newlywed, left for 2 years without her husband, but that's another story. The reason I set you up this way, though, is because I wanted us to consider my topic in the same way we might consider a topic about any other area that we'd be looking into in art history. I know that my topic has a good deal of freight to it. That I accuse Mrs. Cherry of being a modernist probably is not something that would be the least bit shocking to you. We could look at this hypothesis that Emma Richardson Cherry was a modernist. We could evaluate the evidence that we could bring to bear on it. If it's true, we think, we could consider the impact on her work, and we could explore the ramifications of this in her art, the art world in which she lived. And I hope that as we consider these artists, we can approach it with the same sort of dispassionate look. The hypothesis that these artists may have been gay or lesbian, evaluate the evidence, such as it may be, consider the impact on their work if it's true, and explore the ramifications in the art milieu in which they lived. Now, I know this isn't necessarily always an easy thing to do, because the topic I'm dealing with can be loaded with some pretty heavy baggage. There's a phenomenon known as passing that we usually think of in terms of racial issues, which can be life and death, as we know, and is illustrated by the article on the left, talking about the suicide of a successful Army officer who had spent his life both public and private as white when it was revealed that he had a Negro background. Well, that concept doesn't apply just to racial issues. It also applies to the lives of gays and lesbians, with sometimes equally dire consequences. The article on the right from the Dallas Morning News in 1944 talks about the discovery of a nest of homosexuals at the University of Texas at Austin, which resulted in 10 faculty members and 15 students having to leave the school. And of course, I'm old enough to remember Mayor Louis Welch's solution to the AIDS crisis here in Houston, which was to shoot the queers. A joke, of course, he said, which is more or less funny depending on which side of the gun you might be on. And even down to the present, the young man from Westboro Baptist Church on the left feels compelled to express his or someone's very strongly held feelings on the issue. I had a personal taste of the heat of the issue when I went out to Navasota in the fall to visit with the relatives of the artist Kathleen Blackshear. They cordially invited me to come over on a Sunday afternoon, and they welcomed me into their homes, one of which was the Blackshear family home, and they talked about their recollections of Blackshear, who they obviously were very fond of. And they were happy to talk about how she always dressed in a mannish way, and how she smoked cigars, and how they all called her Bill. They were equally happy to talk with me about the recollections of Ethel Spears, who Ethel on the left and Kathleen had met in Chicago. This is an early self-portrait of Kathleen, set interestingly in the galleries at the Art Institute of Chicago. That painting in the upper left is a Van Gogh that's in their collection. They talked about how Kathleen and Ethel had spent most of their adult lives together, how they had moved to Navasota when they retired, and Ethel, by the way, was a Chicago native, but they'd moved to Navasota, and that they'd lived in their Blackshear family home when they were in Navasota. They'd made each other their heirs. They were both buried in the Navasota cemetery, as is Ethel's sister, but not in the Blackshear family plot. And after a while of hearing their discussion of the two, I raised the possibility with them that perhaps Ethel and Kathleen were something more than just companions. I wondered if it might be possible that they were, in fact, a couple. Well, at that point, things got icy and hot at the same time. They made it very clear to me that that was a suggestion they did not want to entertain. And one of them said, well, what difference would it make anyway, since they didn't paint lesbian pictures? We didn't go into what a lesbian picture would be, aside from a picture that was painted by a lesbian, sort of like, is it a Texas picture because of the subject, or is it a Texas picture because it's painted by a Texan? But anyway, I figured at that point that the interview was going to be over. But in fact, it wasn't. They spent another hour and a half or 2 hours driving me around Navasota, showing me work by the two, continuing to talk about them, and in fact invited me to come back to Navasota whenever I wanted to. It was sort of like there was this sudden volcano in the midst of complete calm on either side. These, by the way, are a couple of images that Ethel did. At the top is their women's painting group in Chicago, and that's Kathleen on the left standing. And at the bottom is a detail of a work that Ethel did when the two of them were out and around in Navasota working, and Ethel's on the left, and there's the mannishly dressed Kathleen on the right. As I talked to the women, however, I realized, of course, what I already knew, that it was a very highly charged area, and that it was very important to consider the evidence in dealing with this, so as not to be sort of making wild speculation or even indulging in wish fulfillment. But I also realized that the evidence that I might have to deal with might not be necessarily the conventional kind. And as an example of that, I'll use not a visual artist, but a Houston novelist, William Goyan, who, when he was in the military in World War II, met another serviceman named Walter Burns. And after the war, they were companions, and of course the companions is in quotation marks with a purpose, but for 6 years they were companions. They lived together in Taos and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Portland, Oregon, and London and New York and Chicago. After Goyan's died, his editor, in preparing an edition of his letters, got in touch with Burns, understandably, to include the letters that Goyan had written him. And what he was told was that the letters were of no interest, and so he had discarded them. It's so shocking, it's almost hard to believe that anyone could actually say it, that the letters of a writer written to the person who was most important in his life for a period of 6 years, during the period in which he was his most formative years as a writer. That's when Goyan was writing his first and most highly respected novel, House of Breath, that there was no interest in them, and so he discarded them, or nothing of interest. Well, it became a little more clear what might be going on when I found that Walter Burns himself in the early 1950s had received a PhD in political science, had received an appointment at Cornell in the political science department, had married, and had set himself on course to become one of the most influential neoconservative political theorists of the late 20th century. So he died, by the way, just earlier this year. I was surprised to find that also. But of course, what that told to me was that, in fact, the letters had been destroyed not because there was nothing of interest in them, but because there was very likely a great deal of interest in them. That, however, is a good example of what I face in dealing with this, because so much of the documentation, which we usually base this kind of analysis on, is not there. It either was destroyed by the individuals themselves, was destroyed by their heirs who didn't want that sort of thing to be talked about, or for whatever reason, it's just wasn't recorded. But still, I wanted to base what I was doing on evidence. And so I sat down and made a list of the people I thought I might be interested in looking at, and the kinds of evidence that I thought I might bring to bear on this research. And I sort of gave it a weight so that I would know what's more reliable versus what's less reliable. And I came up with a convenient score on the right-hand side, which is my effort to look pseudoscientific. As a social scientist, you always have to do that. It probably doesn't mean anything, but it made me feel good to do it. So the kinds of evidence I decided I could look at were documentary, letters, journals. Obviously, that's what we really would like to have. But also hearsay, which some would call gossip, which is not always reliable, but does contain a good deal of information that often isn't written down anywhere. Visual, which of course in the case of artists is self-evident that it would be important. Life circumstance, just, how did they live their lives? Sort of like Ethel and Kathleen. They lived together, they moved together, they were buried together. And then conjectural, which in this case I might also have called art history gaydar, and it's wildly unreliable, but it's a place to start. But the first artist I want to look at based on that convenient scoring system didn't quite make the top of the list, but he had things that I could enter in crucial categories, and that's Forrest Bess. He is, among early Texas artists, I think arguably right now, the best known outside of Texas and the most highly regarded. He just had a retrospective at the Whitney Museum in New York, and at the Menil and at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. The paintings that he's best known for now are like the ones like in the lower right, which are called his visionary paintings. But he did a lot of other work, especially early on, in the vein of the upper right painting, which is a portrait of a Mexican boy. I'm going to take the liberty of reading some passages from a letter that Bess wrote in 1950 to friends of his, because he tells his story much better than I could in my own words. Writing to his friends Rosalie and Sidney Berkowitz, who he had met in San Antonio, but who subsequently moved to back east, he said, "I need to talk with you two about something I've been juggling around in my mind for years, and there still seems to be no solution, yet there seems to be no escape from having to look the thing fairly in the face, come what may. There is a part of my makeup that I have never discussed with you. It isn't pretty, and it may be a bitter pill for you to take. It is the price you pay for being my best, and as it seems, my only friends. I am a particular type of homosexual." There, it's written. You can almost feel the relief when he wrote that sentence. Years ago, I realized this, and I learned to pass into other channels any sexual excitement I felt. I'm going to repeat that. I think that's an important passage. I learned to pass into other channels any sexual excitement I felt. The job wasn't too well done, and I found that I had ostracized myself by being the peculiar one in my small hometown. I left Bay City and moved into Houston, and there I found protection in numbers with people I thought were my own kind. The war came on. I channeled the sexual feeling, made an excellent officer, citations and commendations, but I messed up once. Too much to drink and too much excitement, and I found myself in the hospital with a caved-in skull, lead pipe, and, pardon me. Excuse me. That wasn't part of my script. Lead pipe and facing court-martial and disgrace. I swore the day I got out of the Army that never again would anyone ever have an opportunity to use lead pipe or blackmail against me for being homosexual. There has been no sex here for me for the last 3 years because I do not intend hurting my father's business. That would be one thing he couldn't understand at all. But I have knocked myself out, working too hard many times. It is the only way release can be obtained. And I'm going to repeat that again. Working is the only way release can be obtained. I hope whatever action I take, that I do not hurt anyone other than myself. I think that it's not a coincidence that the visionary works that he did, such as the ones at the bottom, in which he said he saw on the insides of his eyelids as he slept, I think it's no accident that they all happened after the lead pipe incident. And I think that after we've read his letter, it certainly is possible to see significance in some of the imagery of those later paintings, which we might have missed had we not had the biographical detail that he shared with us. In another letter to the Berkowitzes, he talked about the art that he had on the walls of his Bay City studio that was art other than his own. Interestingly, the only original work of art that he had was a Jean Charlton watercolor, and I'll be talking about Jean Charlton a bit in a little while. He also had prints of the Life magazine prints of the Limbrook youth that was at the Museum of Modern Art, and a postcard of an Etruscan warrior. This is in the center is a Forrest Bess figure study from 1953, and it's flanked on either side by images of the Limbrook youth. I think it's pretty clear that he was drawing directly on that sculpture as he did the figure study. I think, in fact, that the figure study may be a self-portrait based on comparing it with some photographs of Bess from the period. This is the Etruscan Warrior, which unfortunately subsequently was proved to be a fake, I believe. But he didn't know that in 1952, and it doesn't matter anyway. He found it appealing. And on the right is a Jean Charlton watercolor from the period. This is a Bandera scene from 1947. It's not the one that he would have had, I'm pretty sure, but it is from the period. So what about Bess and the evidence score from my chart? I think the documentary evidence couldn't be any clearer. I mean, he told us in this case. Hearsay, I just haven't talked to anybody yet who says, oh yes, I knew what was going on and everybody was talking about it. So I had to leave that one blank, and that's really one reason his score was somewhat lower than others. Visual evidence, after reading his letter, I think the visual evidence is pretty clear, especially in his visionary paintings, but even in some of the earlier ones. Life circumstance, in his case, is to me, is provocative because he actually did what a number of the people I'll be looking at did, which is to withdraw from the Texas art scene in which they found themselves. Some of them went to other cities in the United States or even overseas. In his case, and in the case of some others, they withdrew from the cities that they were in to virtual recluse life in the country or on the bay for him in Bay City. Conjectural evidence, I think, with him based on his life story, and I haven't told nearly all of his life story by any means, I think it's pretty clear even if we didn't have number one. But so I gave him a score of 11, which was pretty high on my chart. The next artist I want to deal with is Lloyd Goff from Dallas. When I first got into the early Texas art business here, I was somewhat perplexed that I didn't see more of Goff's work or hear more about Goff, because he, in the early 30s, he was one of among that constellation of early Texas or early Dallas artists, as we can see in the photo montage on the right, where Goff is the middle of the third row down. He was in that group that included Frank Ray and Jerry Bywaters and Alexander Hogue and a number of other people that we all know who've at this point been raised to the status of virtual semi-sainthood. So it really surprised me that I didn't hear more about him. And when I asked people, some of them said, well, he left early, and so that's why. And indeed, he did go to New York in the early 30s. Some said he wasn't a very good painter, though, you know, he painted things like this when he was in New York, and which I think is a pretty good WPA era painting. Someone said, well, he was hard to get along with. He was known to be extremely vain, which when I heard that, I thought, that rings a bell. It sort of struck me as sounding like what's said about women in the workplace, that, you know, they're extremely aggressive. And sort of that, okay, this is something that just doesn't sit very well. And then someone said, and he might have been homosexual too, and so I began to have an inkling of what might be going on. As I said, he did go to New York in the early 30s, and one of the significant things for him that happened was he encountered this artist, Paul Cadmus. Cadmus, writing decades later to a researcher wanting his recollections about Goff, said, here are some tidbits of information about Lloyd Goff. Small, well-proportioned, good figure, posed for me, 34 to 37-ish. He posed for my painting Venus and Adonis. Adonis is a good likeness of him at the time, which if that's true, and I assume it is, since Cadmus said it, then I guess we could understand why he might be a little vain. And then Cadmus sort of threw off, we had a brief affair. And he also said that Gough had worked with him as an assistant on some of his WPA mural projects. So Gough certainly would have seen the work Cadmus was doing at the time. This is a painting that Cadmus did as a WPA painting. It wasn't a mural, it was an easel painting, but he did it in the 30s, and it was, when it was first exhibited, the Secretary of the Navy was so incensed at the negative image Cadmus was giving of Navy personnel that he insisted it be taken off view, which it was, and of course the next morning it was on the front page of newspapers all over the country. So Cadmus became instantly famous. Other works of Cadmus that Gough would have seen include Greenwich Village Cafeteria from 1934, which shows many of the denizens of Greenwich Village bohemian life at the time, and also YMCA Locker Room. I know that Gough was familiar with this painting because this print, because he gave copies of this print and a print of the Fleet's Inn to the Dallas Museum of Art. This becomes significant for Texas when we look at Gough's own WPA mural before the fencing of Delta County, which is the Cooper, Texas post office mural of 1939. These are some preliminary sketches that Gough did of the mural to sort of show us how he developed his project, as Sue was saying. I think they're very informative in the way we see his mind working. And if we can compare the more well-worked out sketch of Gough to the Cadmus YMCA print, I think it's pretty clear that Gough was drawing heavily on it, including this double scallop composition, but also on individual figures that he included in his work. The Cadmus on the right and the Gough on the left, of course. It seems to me that he was drawing on many details that he had seen from Cadmus's work as he did his mural composition. These figure groupings look to me an awful lot alike. This over-the-shoulder look here is too similar, I think, to just be an accident. It's interesting that this one is going into the men's room. I think that that's probably something that appealed to Gough. And in this pairing, it's the red necktie and the red neckerchief that I find particularly interesting, because at the time, a red necktie was a sartorial hint that gay men, especially in big cities, gave to each other. So again, I think that that is not really something that was accidental. And it became, not too long after that, the color of bandana and the placement of bandana became a well-worked out code to protect our younger and more sensitive audience members. I've blocked out what the code and the placement actually mean, but needless to say, you needed to know the code and the color code and the placement in order to avoid situations you might not be wanting to get into. Again, I think that it's not an accident that there's a red bandana and a blue bandana, especially considering that these are the only two figures in the whole mural that are wearing bandanas. I also think that the placement of this rifle and the placement of this lariat are not an accident, and that sort of gives new meaning to this disapproving over-the-shoulder look. Now, we're not sure quite what it is he's disapproving here. There's all kind of possibilities. You sort of wonder if the cigarette is premature, or who knows, maybe not. I've read that when the mural was put up in Cooper, it was very popular. I doubt that many of the local people read into it the things that I'm suggesting could be read into it. But I also doubt that many of us will ever look at it again with quite the same So what about Gough and the evidence score? Well, he got a 15, which was the top that I could give. I mean, the documentary evidence based on what Cadmus said and what other people, I've read other people saying, is just, there's no question. Hearsay, lots of people were talking about Gough. Visual, I don't think I need to say much more about that after looking at his mural a little more closely. And the life circumstance evidence is, again, there's no question. It's documented that he had a number of same-sex partners throughout his life. Not one-night stands. I mean, these are longer term than one-night stands. Conjectural, I don't think we even need to conjecture based on all this other evidence. Next, I want to look at pair of artists from here in Houston, Cardin Bailey and Jean Charlton in a self-portrait on the right. Both of them were students of Ola McNeill Davidson. And this whole project sort of got started when I was visiting one day with the granddaughter of Ola McNeill Davidson. Mrs. Davidson, Davidson here on the left, Jean Charlton, Cardin Bailey with his head cut off. And as we were talking, sort of out of the blue, Davidson's granddaughter said to me, "Do you think Cardin Bailey and Jean Charlton were gay?" And it was out of the blue because we really hadn't been saying anything up to that point that would make that question sort of the next logical step in the conversation. But anyway, I said, "Well, yes, I think they probably were." And she said, "Well, I thought so too. I've always thought so." And she told me that she remembered from her girlhood days in the 1950s, and remember that this was 1937, and by the way, they were waiting to board this steamer to go on a trip to Europe, the three of them plus Davidson's teenage son, who presumably is taking the photograph. But my granddaughter friend remembered relatives shaking their heads still in the 1950s saying they couldn't believe that Davidson took her teenage son on a trip to Europe with boys like that. Well, it quickly became clear as I read Davidson's travel journal from this trip that in fact she did know there were boys like that, there was no question, but that it really didn't seem to make any difference to her. And that surprised me in the 1930s. And when I was going through the Cherry archive, I found this postcard that Cardin and Jean had written to Mrs. Cherry, with a clear expectation that she would understand them as a couple, but also with the idea, I think, that they were presenting themselves as a couple. And so not only Ola McNeill Davidson, but Mrs. Cherry knew and accepted them as a couple, and that really did surprise me. And I found out in looking at documentation that in fact they had lived together from at least 1934, the lower right is the city directory from that year, that they were still a household, according to the US Census, in 1940. And their coupleness at that point was confirmed for me when I talked with a cousin of Cardin Bailey, who was very young at that point. But she remembered them very well, and she remembered that they were accepted in her family as a couple. And in fact, Charlton was welcomed at all the family gatherings based on his relationship with Cardin Bailey. And she also remembered that sometime during this period, an aunt had taken her to visit their studio. And she realized much later that the aunt had been trying to tell her as they went what the nature of their relationship was. Now, she was telling her in terms that a 6 or 8 year old girl, of course, didn't understand. But at some point later on, it hit her that her aunt was saying, "Okay, this is what these boys are like." Now, I was really surprised by that, and so I started looking a little more deeply into it. I mean, that could be the case in Houston in the 1930s. That's not the conception we have. What I found, though, was that things were different in the 1930s than they became later on. In the late 20s and the early 30s, there was a craze in the country, in the States, but also in Europe, called the Pansy Craze, in which it became quite fashionable for heterosexuals to go to clubs that were primarily or either exclusively or primarily intended for homosexuals. That, it was sort of that gender ambiguity became a real sort of exciting part of the whole experience. And it even hit in Houston. Those previous ads were from elsewhere, but in Houston there was a club called the Wagon Wheel from at least 1936 to 38, in which female impersonation was the draw. That, of course, is not the same thing as homosexuality by any means, but it is part of that gender ambiguity and the excitement of being involved in something that's a little bit risque. It's interesting, I think, that this ad was specifically directed towards people who were here for the Fat Stock show. So you have to wonder if those cowboys had their color-coded kerchief information right. I've done a good bit more looking about atmosphere, which I won't be able to share here. I'm going to talk about that, atmosphere in the 30s. I'm going to talk about that in a talk down at Heritage Society in the summer in conjunction with an exhibition they're doing. It's a very exciting sounding exhibition on the history of gay lesbian life in Houston. But I went through a publication called the Houston Gargoyle just to see what I could find. It was our version of Vanity Fair, published from 1928 to 1932. And it's where, it's the sort of thing that the sort of with it or think they're with it kind of River Oaks people would read to find out what they should be doing to really be au courant. And one amazing thing I found was the cartoon on the left, which with the caption, which can be read many ways, I found out because I did a survey among friends, the caption that's "What'll it be, men?" or "What'll it be, men?" Which was done by a Houston cartoonist in Houston, published in Houston. It's not something that they got from somewhere else and ran. And in fact, the name of the cartoonist is C. Garza Rivera, who's the only Hispanic heritage artist that I've found in Houston at that period, I mean, down to post-World War II. And we need to find out more about him. I think he was very influential, especially in terms of the development of Dorothy Hood. But anyway, I was amazed also then, this was published in 1930, and I found a cartoon on the right published in Weimar, Germany, in a homosexual publication in Weimar, Germany, in 1929. And these two figures looked like they could be twins. And so Houston was not that far away in some respects from Weimar, Germany in 1930. And it was in that atmosphere, I think, that an article like the one on the left could appear in a general daily publication, the Houston Press, which is not the same as the Houston Press we have now, but with the headline, the studio in the gay Russian style, I think probably the quotation mark should have been on that word up there, talking about Cardin Bailey and Jean Charlton redecorating their studio. And I think that it's certain that the reporter who wrote that article knew the double entendre she was using. I say that because just the year before, a mass market movie like Bringing Up Baby, Cary Grant could declare that he just went gay with the expectation that people are going to know what that means in a mass market around the country. That atmosphere, I think, could lead to a photograph like this, which I think is wonderful, about 1940 with Jean Charlton, Cardin Bailey, a writer friend of theirs named Zoe Leger, Nyon Carlson, and Billy Hart, who was a good friend of William Goyan and did keep the letters Goyan wrote to him, which are very interesting reading, by the way. There was a lot of interest in those letters. I think that it's amusing. If you look at Jean Charlton and Cardin Bailey, they're dressed exactly alike. Exactly. Their hairdos are the same. They're holding their cigarettes the same way. The only difference is the orientation of their legs, which actually brings their toes so close together, it's sort of like saying, "We're queer, we're here, get used to it," a long time before that phrase ever became commonly used. Now that changed, of course, that atmosphere changed. As we know, by the 1950s, homosexuality was virtually tantamount with treason in some respects. Part of that change, I think, had to do with the publication of a book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which we know mostly as more popularly as the Kinsey Report in 1948, in which Kinsey found that 37% of American males had had at least one homosexual experience. Now that's more than 1 in 3. And when you think about this, the sort of impact that kind of statistic would have, people started looking around, wondering about almost every man in their lives, and probably some of the men started looking around, or looking inside, wondering about themselves. And to answer the question of this inquiring Mrs., there was a Mrs. Kinsey, but that was neither here nor there in keeping Kinsey out of the 37%. So it was in that atmosphere that this kind of photograph could be published in the paper and not raise any eyebrows in 1937. But this photograph, I think, also indicates the impact on these two artists of their relationship, because clearly Cardin Bailey is giving Jean Charlton pointers on a sort of John Marin inflected watercolor that Charlton was working on. These are a couple of Charlton watercolors from the period which I put in just because I needed to have more pictures of art. They actually, in fact, collaborated on a few projects, including this gift booklet that they prepared for friends, to which each of them donated or gave 2 prints, Charlton on the right, and this is a Cardin Bailey print of their home and studio. I've already mentioned that there was a Jean Charlton watercolor on the wall of Forrest Bess's Bay City studio. And I don't know the full extent of their either personal or professional interchange. I do know that they had a school together briefly in Houston in the late 1930s. And when Charlton came back to Houston in 1960, at the time of his mother's funeral, he hadn't been in Houston for almost 10 years at that point, but a friend of theirs, a mutual friend, drove Charlton from Houston to Bay City so that he and Bess could spend a night talking together and drinking, apparently, a great deal. And it's interesting that this chart in the upper left, which is a chart that Bess prepared of symbols that he used in his visionary paintings with what the symbols mean. If you look at that chart and you look at this Charlton painting from 1952, there's a remarkable number of those symbols that appear in this painting. So there must have been some interchange between them at that point. I know that Charlton was very much influenced by a Pacific Northwest artist named Mark Tobey, who was himself gay. They showed together in New York several times in the early 1950s. Another influence on Charlton was a couple of Scottish artists, popularly known as the Two Roberts, thank goodness, because I can't pronounce that second last name there, which I just found out that they, in fact, are the subject of a joint retrospective in Edinburgh right now. He met the Two Roberts when he was stationed in England in World War II, and he wrote about that experience to Cardin Bailey in a letter, which he began, "Dearest Cardie," and ended with "Love as always." But he talks about how he felt that the Two Roberts and Cardin Bailey and Jean Charlton were a movement of some sort, which he felt sure Cardin Bailey would immediately understand. He also mentions that they have to move to either San Francisco or New York after the war in order to pursue their art. This is a Jean Charlton, lost Jean Charlton painting on the left and one of the Roberts painting on the right. Another important influence which needs to be explored further on Charlton's work was Cy Twombly. I just have some very sketchy information about that. They both they both had studios in the same building in Rome in the early 60s called Palazzo Pio, and a journalist writing about Palazzo Pio said, there has inevitably been Twombly and Charlton sharing a certain lyricism in terms of linear relationships. And I wouldn't speculate on which way the exchange went. I have a Charlton painting from 1952 and a Twombly painting from 2007 here, and I'll let you guess which is which. There may in fact have been an earlier influence of the two. I think it is indicated by the Charlton monoprint on the left from 1953, and the page on the right from Twombly's sketchbook from 52 or 53. I'm not sure which, but I do know that Charlton and Twombly were both in New York in 1953 at the same time, after Twombly had returned from travel in Europe and a brief affair with Robert Rauschenberg. Okay, so I'm supposed to check the time now. What time is it? I probably have used all my time. I'll assume that I have because I tend to, yes, okay. I will just go back to my chart and indicate that there are obviously a number of other people further down the list who will have to save for a part 2 of this talk, but I hope that we've been able to achieve what I set out to do, which is to explore this subject as we would explore any other art historical subject, and hopefully find something valuable in our understanding of these artists and their work. Thank you.